minimize that. All right, so again, thank you all for inviting me this evening. I'm going to be talking, as Christine said, about research that we've done both at Davis and work that other groups have done as well, about using our gardens to support bees, and specifically this evening talking about our California native bees. I want to start right off by acknowledging our supporters. The Haven is a self-supporting facility, so we do rely completely on grants, donations, and the work of our volunteers. And so these supporters have been tremendously important over the last several years in both supporting the Haven, and then in the case of the Botanic Garden and the Tree of Life Nursery, in supporting some of the research that I'll be covering today. So I think to start out, it's important to recognize, over the last century or so of bee research, the vast majority of the work that's been done with bees and plants and habitat has been done either in wild settings, natural preserves or other relatively undisturbed habitats, or in agricultural settings, extremely disturbed habitats. And it's been only in the last 15 or so years that we've really begun to develop an appreciation for just how diverse in terms of species and abundant in terms of numbers bees can be in urban settings. And the list on the left here is just a snapshot of some of the more recent notable studies that have been done documenting this. And I'll point out that we're very fortunate in terms of our knowledge about bees in gardens, and that much of this work has been done in California and has specifically been focusing on native bees. So about us at the Haven on the UC Davis campus, we serve mostly to provide both information and inspiration for urban bee gardeners, folks who maybe are in a suburban or an urban setting and want their gardens to be more sustainable and to support more wildlife. And we also do a lot of outreach with school groups, garden clubs, beekeeping groups, folks like that. And we also, when we have the funds, offer undergraduate internships so that we can educate the next generation. And I think if you take nothing away from tonight's presentation, it's to really remind ourselves that we're worried about the wrong bees. All of the press, or I would say 99% of the press, about bees and bee health and bees going extinct has focused on honeybees. Honeybees are not native to North America, they're native to Eastern Europe. And honeybees are essentially managed livestock. So thinking that honeybees are going to go extinct is kind of like saying that cows are going to go extinct. We have ways to rear queen bees, to artificially inseminate them. And while there certainly are concerns about honeybee health and the availability of honeybees for crop pollination, in terms of really being concerned about bees that are really in trouble and at risk of going extinct, it's our native bees that we need to be concerned about. And bees are tremendously diverse animals. And we're fortunate here in California to have about 40% of the North American bee fauna, 1,600 of the roughly 4,000 species. And I think as native plant gardeners, you can appreciate that this is really driven by the diversity of our native plants, because bees and plants are completely intertwined in terms of how they rely on each other, and over time, of course, how they've evolved together. Worldwide, there are at least 20,000 species of bees, probably more as more continue to be discovered. And the important thing for understanding our native bees is that unlike honeybees, most of them are solitary. So honeybees are social insects. This means that there's a division of labor among the group and some kind of care of the young. And that's not the case for solitary bees. There's no queen with solitary bees. There's simply a male and a female. They mate, she lays eggs, and then a year or so later, those eggs hatch. And the big difference in terms of sustainability and keeping that colony or that population going is that if a honeybee queen dies, the bees have the ability to make a new queen. But if a female solitary bee dies, that's it. She's not replaced, and all of the potential offspring eggs that she might have laid of course, are lost as well. And most of our native bees, about 70%, nest underground. And this is really important to understand in terms of designing and including features in our gardens that are going to support native bees. And then the other 30% are above ground. And I mentioned that we have a large number of native bees in California, as I said, about at least 1,600. And even in a small garden like the Haven, which is a ½ acre, we've seen over 80 species. And these bees are really diverse. This picture here shows the smallest and the largest of the bees found in our garden. On the left is the Valley Carpenter Bee, and on the right is a very small sweat bee. And these are both native bees, but I think you can appreciate that these two bees are going to need very different types of flowers in order to successfully forage for pollen and nectar. And I think the other thing I mentioned to take away from tonight's presentation is the fact that we are focusing on the wrong bees. The other thing to think about is that there's so much potential to do more for our bees. Admittedly, this photograph or this paper and this image are not recent. It's from 2005. This is based on satellite data from NASA showing the proportion of areas that are covered with turf grass. More recent estimates in California is that we have about 2.8 million acres that's just covered with turf. And the vast majority of that is only walked on when somebody mows it. And so this represents a tremendous opportunity to replace some of that turf with plants that are actually going to be supportive, not only of bees, but of other wildlife. And so again, I think this is a really, really important idea to take away, is that there's so much potential out there to improve the habitat for bees. And many, many studies have documented that one of the most important factors driving concerns or driving problems with bee health is lack of adequate forage. They just don't have enough good, healthy food to eat. And it's just like if we don't have an adequate diet, we're more likely to get sick. And exactly the same is true for bees. And then with our native bees, because so many of them do nest underground, turf is not a suitable habitat for nesting. So providing something more suitable in the garden is also going to be really, really important. And so let's go on now to talk about the common bees that we'll see in urban gardens. And I am going to start with the honeybees simply because these are what most folks are likely to see, and they serve as a good reference point for making identifications about other bees, because this is a bee that most everyone recognizes. And honeybees are in the family Abedi, which is the largest family within bees. And honeybees are active year-round. Anytime it's over 55 degrees and sunny, there will be insect activity. So that essentially means that our honeybees are active year-round. And there are feral honeybee colonies everywhere. So even if you don't have somebody nearby who's maybe managing a honeybee colony, there are going to be honeybees present. And of course, an additional complicating factor for you in San Diego that we don't deal with here is the Africanized honeybee. And there's no way you can distinguish them visually. It's based on the behavior is how you would tell if you had Africanized bees or not. And as you can see from this photograph, honeybees are have a very broad feeding range. So over on the left there, for example, she's foraging on manzanita in January. And on the our native milkweeds over on the right as well, in addition to using exotic species. So let's move on now to talk about our native bees. Probably the next most common would be Carpenter bees. And this is the Valley Carpenter bee over on the left. That's that big black one that I showed you a few slides ago. And the male of that bee is what's shown on the left. And you'll notice that I'm touching him with my finger. Only female bees sting. So you can touch male bees. And this is a great way to teach kids about bees and teach them to lose their fear of bees, is we can actually allow them to hold bees in their hand. And this Valley Carpenter bee is down in your area as well. So this is something that probably many of you have seen. And then in the center is the Mountain Carpenter bee, a related species, also native. And this one has a preference for nesting in redwood. And so in our area, we see it up in the Sierra foothills, and it's moved down into the Central Valley as we've included many, many more redwood structures in our garden. And the thing to note about carpenter bees is they have a different feeding habit from all other bees. And you'll notice in that center photograph, you can see that she's inserting her proboscis, her mouth parts, into the base of the flower. So carpenter bees are the only bees, and these carpenter bees nest above ground, but they are the only bees that nest above ground that can excavate their own nests. They have mouth parts that are essentially like tiny little saws, so they're able to actually cut through wood. And they can use that to their advantage in foraging, as you see in the center there, because the carpenter bee is far too large to fit into many flowers. And in this case, she's on a marin pink epilobium. But what they can do instead is make a slit. They cut a slit at the base of the flower with those unique mouth parts and insert their tongue down into the nectary to what we call nectar rob from those flowers. And it's called robbing because they're obtaining the floral reward without doing any pollination. Another very common group of bees, and in this case, all native bees that we would see in our gardens are the bumblebees. And we tend to see these more in riparian areas. For example, here in the Sacramento area, we see these at the Haven because we're near a creek that runs through campus. And in Sacramento, the American and Sacramento rivers converge, and we tend to see these again near the areas of those two rivers that run through Sacramento. So if you've got a slough or a river or some kind of body of water that's year round near you, you're probably going to be more likely to see bumblebees. And the bees that are pictured here are the ones that we see most commonly in gardens, or I should say the top three in the photograph here, are the ones that we see most commonly in gardens. On the left is the yellow-faced bumblebee, Bombus vosnesenskii, and then in the center is the black-faced. And these are the two most common, and they are pretty easily identified because they're the only bumblebees that'll just have that one stripe on the abdomen that you can see clearly in the photo on the left. And then the other way to tell them apart is that the yellow-faced has yellow on the clypeus, which is essentially the face, and then the black-faced is solid black. And then over on the right, on that lavender, is the black-tailed bumblebee, which is probably the next most common one in gardens up here. And I did include in the materials that I sent ahead of time to Christina a great bumblebee identification guide that you can use while you're out working in your gardens to get a better sense of identifying different bumblebees. And what I like about that guide is, in addition to having photographs and identification information, it has a seasonal calendar, so you can tell when they're active, and that helps to confirm which bee you're actually seeing. The bumblebee on the lower right is Bombus van Dijkii, Van Dyke's bumblebee, less common in gardens. And then I'll also mention that I think many of you are aware that a filing with the under the California Endangered Species Act was made a while back, and that included two bumblebees, and one of those was Bombus crachii, and that bee we have seen at the Haven. So that's kind of exciting to know that we do have a bee that is at risk being supported in our garden. And still staying in the family Abedi, the Longhorn bees are another very common group, and they get their name from their very long antennae, which you can see in these photographs. They have a preference, although they're certainly not exclusive, but they do have a preference for plants in the Asteraceae, so you will see them a lot on sunflowers. And these are solitary bees. And as is typical with all of the solitary bees, it's the females who do most of the work. They're the ones that are building the nests, laying the eggs, provisioning the food into the nests. The males basically just hang out and wait for females. And so at night, the males are essentially homeless. They don't go down into the nests. And they'll form these sleeping aggregations that you see in that center photograph. And so if you've ever gone out in your garden, either very early in the morning or just before sunset, and seen clusters of bees on plant stems, that's what you're looking at. And these are, again, they look superficially like honeybees. They're a little bit smaller and stockier in that the abdomen is rounder, not quite as elongated as a honeybee, but it's those long antennae that really serve to distinguish this group. And then another extremely common and very broad group of bees are the sweat bees in the family Helicity. And this, as I said, is a very large, diverse group. Some of these are social and some of them are solitary. Some of them nest underground, some of them above ground, but they're all quite small. You can get a sense of the size of these. The one on the left, on the upper left photo, is in the center of a Shasta daisy. And then that one in the center, that's the flower of Cleveland sage. So you can see just how tiny that little bee is. And these are quite common, but often quite overlooked because they are so small. People tend to think there may be a mosquito or some kind of gnat or something. But the dead giveaway, at least for the females, and it is only the females who are collecting pollen, is that you would see the pollen on the legs. Another large group of bees that you may not have seen the bee, but have certainly seen the nest building, is the Megachilidae, the leafcutter bees. And in our area, these bees have a preference for our native redbud. And as you can see on the left, there's a large number of leaf pieces that have been removed from that plant in order to do nest construction. And if you look at the nesting blocks on the upper right, you can see many of those tubes are filled, and some of them are still filled with bright green material. So those have recently been filled. And then as the leaf material in there ages, it turns brown. Some of them are also filled with mud. And then some of them are also filled with plant hairs. So even though this group is called the Leafcutter Bees, depending on the particular species, they use a variety of materials for nest building. But what they all have in common is that they nest in abandoned beetle galleries in the wild. And these nesting blocks that have become so popular to put in our gardens is how we can replicate that habitat in an area where there may not be a lot of beetle-killed trees. And these bees will go out and forage and collect pollen and nectar, bring that back to the nest. Once they've collected enough, she will lay an egg on it, and then she goes out and gets the leaf material, the mud, whatever it is that her species uses, and she wraps that whole thing up. And she repeats the process until the nesting hole is filled. And these bees typically only live for maybe 6 weeks or so. And so then she dies, and then the following year, the bees will emerge. So now that we've had an introduction to the bees that are most commonly seen in our gardens, I want to talk a little bit about how bees find their host plants, because I think this is really helpful to understand some things that we can incorporate as we design our gardens to make them more amenable to being used by bees. And so bees see color differently than we do. They see in the ultraviolet spectrum. Purple, yellow, and white are the colors that are most visible to them. And they will use color both for long-range plant finding as well as for plant finding up close. So when you think about your garden, what's going on there is bees maybe are flying over your garden. Some of them may be even higher up, being carried on wind currents. They'll see those color cues as they pass over. And if they see something that is attractive to them, they'll then fly down to investigate. So in addition to color, contrast, that's contrast between different colors, as well as how saturated the colors are. These are all important cues that bees are going to use in the long range to start to hone in on your garden. Because when you think about a tiny little bee having to find the center of a flower where the pollen and nectar are located in the middle of all the visual noise of roads and cars and people and buildings, it's really kind of amazing how they've evolved to use these various cues to be able to efficiently do that. The other thing that we know about bees and how they sense color is that they can quickly distinguish between different colors, but distinguish more slowly between similar colors. So this suggests an idea of perhaps planting in blocks of different colors in the garden to help allow them to maybe, if you've got a preferred plant, to maybe help that really stand out. And then in addition to color, they use floral cues. And there's a continuous, of course, we don't sense it, but there are continual floral cues rising up off of our gardens that bees can use from a long range as well as for close-up food location. And bees also, in that complex visual landscape that I just talked about, use contrast to find the specific flower resource that they need. And a good example of this is that green appears dark to bees. So that provides great contrast of that flower against the foliage in a plant, which helps the bee to hone in on that flower where it's going to find the food resources it needs. And flowers that are particularly attractive and useful to bees tend to have ultraviolet absorbing centers. So that ultraviolet light is seen best in the center of the flower, and edges on the flower that reflect UV, again, to help direct the bee into the center of the flower where the pollen and nectar resources are located. Some other things that are important to think about is that edge structure has been shown to possibly help bees find plants. And what we mean by that is the edge between two different types of habitat. So for example, a forest that opens into an open meadow. The margin between those two areas is going to be a site that's rich in bees. And we can, again, use this kind of concept in our own gardens when we think about how we're laying out our plants to maybe have a large shrub border that's going to be green most of the year, to have those flowers that we want the bees to get to be right up against that, so that you have that good edge structure and contrast. And indeed, there's been a lot of work in Great Britain with bumblebees. They have a large citizen science project there that goes where folks go out and look for bumblebee nests. And they found that bumblebees prefer to nest along linear gradients like fences and garden edges. And here's some examples of some of those floral features that help bees to find those pollen or nectar resources. The photograph on the upper left is a Texas Ranger, and then we have one of our native lupins in the center. And on both of those, you can see the spots called a nectar guide. It is essentially like a runway landing strip directing the bees right into the center of that flower where the resources they need are located. And then over on the upper right is a Fremontodendron flower that I'm shining an ultraviolet light on. And you can see how the nectar in the center of that flower fluoresces bright blue. So that's what the bee would see when it approaches that flower. So that's going to be a good aid for it to find that center where the resources it needs are located. So we've talked about some of the common bees you're going to see in your gardens. Some of the ways that we can maybe think about bee biology and incorporate that into design. But what are the characteristics, the features that we need to include in our gardens to make sure that they're going to be supportive of bees? Like all animals, bees need food, water, and shelter. And we'll talk about each of these. Food, of course, is plants, the pollen and the nectar. And so I want to start with that. And something that we get asked a lot at the Bee Haven is a lot of people assume that if it's got a flower, it must be good for bees. And they assume that all plants are the same in terms of the resources they provide for bees. And unfortunately, that is not the case. Different plants vary widely in the food value of both their pollen and their nectar. Some plants don't provide both resources in ways that are accessible to bees. And most of the bees that we see in our urban gardens are general feeders, which means that they can utilize a lot of different plants, and in fact are healthier if they have a variety of plants in their diet. Just like us, we need to have a variety of food in order to get all of the vitamins and nutrients that we need. The same is true for bees. What's interesting, especially in the last 5 or 8 years or so, as gardening for bees has become more and more interesting and important, and something that marketers and people who sell plants really want to promote, is that many different bee plant lists have been developed. And about 5 years ago, a group in Great Britain took a look at all of the bee plant lists that they could get their hands on and evaluated them and determined that the scientific basis, the reason why those plants were being recommended was not always clear. And they also found that lists could vary greatly, even recommendations for similar or the same regions. And so for these reasons, we encourage folks to select lists from reputable sources. And some suggestions, UC Berkeley and their Urban Bee Lab they've been investigating bees and garden plants for close to 20 years now. And they publish a plant list based on what's blooming in different seasons. And of course, their recommendations are going to be geared more for the coastal Northern California climate. Our plant list at the Haven is an Excel spreadsheet, so you can search it. And we include the sunset growing zones. So you could include that as a search criteria on our plant list. But then I would also encourage you to check out the website of the UC Cooperative Extension San Diego Pollinator Project. And I'll be talking more about their research in a couple of minutes because they're of course, are lists that are going to be best geared for most of your gardens. And so some other things to think about with food, I mentioned the idea of having a variety of different plants available. And a good way to approach this is to have a mix of plant families. Plant family roughly corresponds to plant chemistry. So different families are going to have different secondary plant compounds that are going to be beneficial for bees. And interestingly, two of those secondary plant compounds that have been found to be in many cases very helpful, at least for honeybees, are caffeine and nicotine, because these actually have antimicrobial and anti-disease properties that are helpful for bees. Continuous bloom is also important. You know, in our mild climate, there's going to be bee activity year round, so we need to have something blooming all the time. And then if you think back to that photo I showed in the beginning of the tiny little sweat bee and that inch-long Carpenter Bee, obviously different flowers, shapes, and sizes is going to be really important. And some bees may have a preference for certain colors, but in general, the blue, the yellow, and the white are going to be the most preferred. And then finally, the idea, if possible, is to plant in drifts so that we have clusters of the same plant together rather than scattering them around the garden, because this helps that foraging process be more efficient. Remember, I talked about the bees are finding color and scent cues. If those are concentrated in an area, that can help them in terms of host finding. And going on now to talk specifically about studies looking at plants for bees, a study similar to what I'm going to talk about, what we have done in California in a few minutes with replicated plots done in Great Britain, found that they got, first of all, mostly honeybees and bumblebees, but no correlation between the plants that are preferred by the two groups of bees. And for us wanting to garden for native bees, this is important because a lot of the plant lists that are out there are geared for honeybees, and in many cases are based on decades old work that was done when we thought that honeybees were the only bees that mattered. So that again is a reason to really kind of take a look at, and both our plant list and the Berkeley plant list give specific bee species. You can tell that we're recommending things for some of our native bees. The other thing that was interesting in the Great Britain study was that they found 100-fold difference in flower attractiveness. So there are plants that are attractive, and then there are plants that are really, really attractive. And the mint family seemed to be the most attractive overall. And that's, again, interesting because bees don't get pollen from plants in the mint family. But what this suggests is that there's something about that nectar in plants in the mint family that's very, very healthy for bees. And this really sort of tells us that this is maybe an area for research in the future to figure out what it is in those flowers that's so valuable for bees. And then again, kind of a similar study done in Spain found that even within that very attractive mint family group, there were large differences between the plants that were the most preferred. And another question that comes up a lot when we talk about gardening for insects is the idea of native plants. And in many cases, having native plants for our native insects is really important. And probably the best example of this is with native butterflies. And I'm sure many of you know that the larvae of our native butterflies and moths have certain very specific host plant requirements. And that's a really good example of where native plants are very, very important for supporting native insects. Interestingly, for bees, we find that this is not necessarily the case. There are some bees in our urban garden that specialize on a very limited group of plants. An example of this is the bees in the genus Diadasia, which you see on the right here in that globe mallow flower. They are specialists in the mallows. So Spiralcia malacophamnus, for example, are two that these bees are going to specialize in. But generally in disturbed habitats, which our gardens really are, the results of numerous studies looking at whether or not whether or not those native bees do better if they have more access to native plants, results have really been mixed. And in some studies, it's actually been found that our native bees do better when they have a mix of both native and non-native plants. And that's because the non-native plants extend the bloom season beyond the time when many of our native flowers have stopped blooming. So this is something that's not quite as important in terms of having native plants in the garden, not quite as important for bees as it is for other insects. So if you want to have a mix of both native and non-native in your garden, you don't need to worry that that is in any way harming the bees. I want to go on now and talk about water. Water is important to include in gardens for bees. This is especially true for honeybees, but also for some of the native bees as well. And what's interesting is that honeybees prefer what we call dirty water. And I'll preface this to say that the vast majority of the work that has been done looking at things like water preferences or plant preferences or the effect of those things like nicotine and caffeine that I mentioned have been done with honeybees. And that is because of their economic importance. About 85% of all our crop pollination is accomplished with honeybees. And so that's a huge gap in our research knowledge that I think, fortunately, is really starting to be aggressively addressed by bee researchers around the US and really around the world. So I think in the next several years, we're going to have a lot better information about things specific to bees other than honeybees. But in the meantime, we're sort of stuck extrapolating for the information that we have from honeybees. But what's interesting to note is that, at least in these studies with honeybees, they preferred what's called dirty water. And this was essentially water that had organic debris in it. When we think about water in gardens, we generally think first about bird baths and how important it is to keep those clean. And it's kind of just the opposite for our bees, because what's happening there is those organic materials, the leaves and other plant debris that's fallen in their water source, leaches out minerals and other nutrients into that water. And the bees are actually obtaining some of their nutrition from the water that they drink. And some work has shown that honeybees will actually change their water source over the course of a year if they find a water source that contains a mineral that they are deficient in. Some ways to provide water for bees in the garden include a shallow pot bottom, something that's maybe 3/4 of an inch deep. Just keep that filled with water and have something in it that the bees can stand on. Like you see in the photo on the right, they won't land in water, but they like to stand on something like these corks that are floating in this pot bottom. Another way to provide water in the garden for bees is with a soaker hose. The photo on the left, we've taken one and coiled it up to make a plant pot. And then we connect that to a water source on a timer so that it emits small drops of water for several hours a day, and the bees can drink those drops of water. And then finally, shelter. In the case of honeybees, of course, the beekeeper is providing the hive. But for our native bees, we have to make sure that we have features in the garden that will allow them to effectively build their nests. And probably the most important thing out of anything we can provide in the garden in terms of nesting for our native bees is some bare ground. Because, as I said, about 70% of them are nesting underground, and they can't go through mulch or turf. They have to have access to bare soil. So leaving a strip of soil, in an area, say next to a garage or somewhere not as noticeable, is really important. The other thing you can do is if you've got pavers set in your garden, instead of putting them in cement, set them in sand so that the bees can get through that sand to build nests. The other things that are important in terms of shelter features are rock and stone crevices, like a dry stack wall or a dry stream bed. Early in the year when it's cool out, those masonry structures will absorb heat, and the bees that are flying early, like our bumblebee queens, who can come out as early as January, they'll land on those to warm up because, of course, bees are cold-blooded animals and can't control their own body heat. And then conversely, in the hottest parts of the year, they can use those cracks and crevices for shade. And then finally, for carpenter bees, leaving old stumps and logs in the garden can be helpful. And then I wanted to show you an example from my own garden about bees and nesting of the bees that nest in the ground, and some of those things that I've talked about. This is a pathway where you can see on the left, I've got some native grasses and mulch, and then it's bordered with river rock. And then the pathway itself is essentially just bare soil with a little bit of debris mixed in it. And the areas that I've got circled where you see those piles of soil, those are nests that have been excavated. In the case of the larger hole that you see on the right, that was one of the longhorn bees, and then the smaller nest entrance is a sweat bee. And those bees, they've excavated all that soil. And I think what's interesting is you'll notice, first of all, of course, they're using the bare soil, but they've done it along that border. And I only showed you two here, but that entire pathway all along that border has every summer now I see bee nests there. So this is, I think, a great example of exactly how they use both bare soil and those marginal areas in order to build their nests. And then finally, talking about the above ground nesting, those 30% or so of the bees that in the wild would use abandoned beetle galleries. The bee houses that we see basically everywhere now in garden centers are designed to mimic that habitat. And unfortunately, most of the ones that we see in our garden centers are not designed with bee biology in mind. So some things to keep in mind when you are selecting one of those is that they need to be stationary. Houses that swing in the wind are unlikely to be used, and that wood is preferred. So basically, you're wanting to mimic the tree that they would be nesting in the wild. And then you want a cavity diameter that corresponds to their body size. And I've got a good range listed here. And the other thing I'll mention with the leafcutter bees that use this type of nesting habitat, unlike other bees that carry their pollen on the legs, the leafcutter bees carry the pollen on the underside of the abdomen. And of course, this makes sense because they're going in and out of a little tube. If it was on their legs, it would likely get knocked off. So this is a great way. If you see bees in your gardens with pollen on the abdomen, you know right away that you've got leafcutter bees. And I just wanted to mention something about the utility of using these bee blocks because they have been so widely promoted in the gardening literature and in the gardening media and in garden centers. Probably the best study that we have of these was done in Toronto over 3 years, where they placed 600 of these bee blocks in a variety of garden settings. And what they found was that native wasps were more abundant than bees, and they used about 75% of all of the blocks they put out. Many of the bee species using these were introduced. They weren't the native bees they were hoping to find. And the larger the bee hotel, in other words, many of those blocks put together, you had higher rates of parasitism. And not surprisingly, native bee species were most abundant, the more wild, and I put that in quotation marks, the habitat was. So residential gardens, as opposed to a more urban park or community garden. And I think this really serves as a caution that while these blocks are great to use, they need to be used judiciously. You don't want to have entire walls of these things because you're just going to be encouraging species you don't want and encouraging diseases and parasitism. So here's an example of what I would call a bee hotel on the left. You can see there's about a dozen of these blocks together. One or two is fine, and it can be really entertaining to watch the bees move in and out of these. But a situation like this is just going to encourage disease spread. And the other thing to keep in mind is that many of the plants that we have in our gardens have hollow stems. And that, as humans, we're tending to think that the bees are only going to be using something horizontal because it's the direction that makes sense to us. But bees work in every dimension. And so leaving plants like this sedum that have hollow stems, leaving some of those stems behind in the garden when you prune can be great to see if the bees will use those for nesting habitat as well. And then I'm just going to finish up now by talking about the research that we've done both at UC Davis as well as down at San Diego Botanic Garden and the Tree of Life Nursery. So really the folks at Berkeley, in collaboration with UC Davis scientists, really started this idea of looking at landscape plants throughout California to determine what bees were using what plants. And they generated enough information to publish this great book, California Bees and Blooms. And as California bee gardeners, it's a tremendous resource for us, both in terms of learning about plant material, learning about native bee identification and habitat. And unfortunately, this book now seems to be out of print. So if you've got a copy, hold on to it. Otherwise, you're probably going to have to pay a premium on the used book market. And the work that we did both at Davis and then in collaboration with our partners down in San Diego was to build on the work that was done by the Berkeley and Davis team looking in gardens throughout California, was to look at some of the plants that they found to be highly preferable and to kind of hone in on what was really going to be the best among all those plants. And the way that we counted bees in our Northern California studies, we grouped them as either honeybees or other bees, the other bees all being native bees that you see pictured here. And if you take a look at that leafcutter bee in the bottom there, you can see that pollen on her abdomen. And so this work was sponsored by the USDA and was part of a nationwide study. There were about 10 teams altogether, but California was the only Western group that was represented. So that was a little bit challenging for us in terms of trying to explain the difference in seasons and plant phenology here in the West as opposed to the rest of the country. But we did this both in replicated field plots, like you see on the left, where we had 15 plants with 5 replications of each, and these were sampled over 4 years. And then we also did sampling at the Bee Haven Garden. And over the course of this, we supported a number of student interns who you see in the lower photographs. And they've all gone on to some kind of career in some aspect of agriculture or plant biology. So it's great that they were able to learn from this project and then put that into use in their careers. And then we also had citizen science involvement as well. And Abedi, who you see pictured on the left, was a retired botanist who was instrumental in doing a lot of our sampling as well. And then similar work was done down in San Diego or down in Southern California at the Tree of Life Nursery, shown on the left, and then at the San Diego Botanic Garden on the right. And the two groups use different sampling methods, and these are both ways that are used by bee scientists to count bees, either timed counts, where you look at a plant for 3 to 5 minutes and make one observation per day, or do what's called a snapshot, where you look very quickly, but you make many different observations. And this was valuable for us because we really found that different bees were active at different times of the day. And so that snapshot method allowed you to better capture that. And the plants that we looked at here in Northern California, as you can see, there's several different plant families were represented, from the Asteraceae down to the Verbenaceae. And I've got the genera listed here. We had, I'd say about 2/3 of our plants were non-native, and about 1/3 of the plants we looked at were natives. And these are our results from Northern California. And you should have gotten copies of these charts ahead of time, because I know it can be kind of challenging to look at the data on a small screen and really take it all in. So I'd encourage you to go back and take a look at those at your leisure. And we've got this divided up by honeybees on the left, and then those other bees that I talked about on the right. And this is the same plant genus in both cases. And we have the 3 sampling years represented here. We did do some sampling in 2021, but that was such a bad drought for us up here that we had so little bloom and so little bee activity that we basically weren't really able to use that data. A couple of things stand out from this, and this is showing the average number of honeybees or other bees per minute. That's the numbers that you see there. And then the ranks, which one was the highest number down to the lowest, are shown in those 3 columns on the right-hand side of each bee. And so a couple of things really stand out. With the honeybees, for example, there's much more consistency from year to year. So for example, the Perovskia, the Russian sage, which is now a salvia, which is about 2/3 of the way down on the chart, you can see that was either 1, 2, or 3 in every year. Whereas the salvia, and that actually groups together a couple of different salvia species, were kind of more in the middle, but again, consistent from year to year. Whereas with the other bees, because that's representing a much broader range of bees, we have a lot more variation. Some things were highly preferred one year and not so much the second year. And this is something that we hope to in the future go on and look at in a lot more detail to get better information about plant selection by native bees. And then in the managed garden, we were looking at a wider range of plants, but without the replication that we had in those field plots. But interestingly, we tended to see pretty similar results. For example, the Perovskia, the Russian sage, was one of the most preferred by honeybees in that managed garden as well. But the results were quite different with the native bees. Some things that really stood out were the Gaillardia, the blanket flower, and that was mostly the Longhorn bees because they do like plants in the Asteraceae. And then our native asters were also well used by these bees also. And then moving now to the studies done in Southern California, again, some crossover with plant families, but some differences as well. And likewise, some crossover with plant genera, but of course, some things that are more unique or better used in your area than in ours. These are the results first from the replicated field plot at the nursery. And we've got, again, honeybees on the left and other bees on the right. And in this case, the data is merged together for all years. So again, in their case, salvia did a little bit better than it did for us. Toyon, which we didn't evaluate because we already have a lot of data from Northern California showing how highly preferred Toyon is for bees. And this, of course, data from Southern California bears that out. The Sphaerosia, the native globe mallow, highly preferred by the other bees in Southern California. Our native buckwheat, the Eriogonum, this was something that was highly preferred in this study, as well as for us in our garden studies in Northern California. And then moving on to the work done at the Botanic Garden, again, a wider range of plant material. You can see again the Gaillardia, highly preferred by honeybees. Not so much in their case by the other bees. This was something that seemed to be preferred by the native bees more for us in Northern California. Again, as I mentioned, obviously these studies are not comprehensive in terms of all of the plants we might have in our gardens, but I think served as a really good way to kind of hone in on, out of all the plants that are out there, what are some that we really want to think about including in our gardens. And the next step with this is to go on and publicize this information, get it out there through forums just like this. What we've done in Northern California is come up with recommendations for what we call bees per gallon. So this is going to be the plants that are going to bring in the most bees, but need the least amount of water. So how can we really maximize that very valuable limited resource? And so I've developed this for Northern California. We're currently working on incorporating the data from Southern California so that we have recommendations for the whole state. because I think this is obviously something that's just going to be more and more important as we move forward with developing our gardens for bees. And then I'll also mention that we have some planting plans on our website, and again, focusing on our Northern California plants, but might give you some ideas for Southern California as well. Our student intern for the last 2 years was a landscape architecture major, and this was on one of the final projects that she developed for us as part of her work. Because a lot of folks don't really know where to begin when they're starting to put together a garden. So I think having some of these things laid out for them can be very helpful. And then finally, I just want to mention our next steps. So the funding that we currently have is from the California Department of Food and Agriculture. And we're working both in Northern and Southern California to take this information that we've generated over the last 4 years to teach the nursery industry about the plants that are best for bees, and also to teach them about some of those garden characteristics that are really helpful, so that as they advise folks in garden centers or commercial landscape customers, they're educated to provide the correct information for them. Because obviously we want to have the right plants and the right features in our gardens to make sure that they're doing all that they can to support our bees. The other thing that we're doing is evaluating those 2 different sampling methods I talked about to find out one that's going to work best for growers, so that as they introduce new plants to the market, they have a way to quickly assess which are the ones that are best for bees. And then next year, we hope to get funding from the USDA to continue this plant evaluation work, to look at things like native versus non-native, planting patterns, planting in those drifts, maybe planting all the pollen providing plants together. Does irrigation matter? If we cut back on irrigation, how does that affect plant nectar? So a lot of important ecological questions that we can directly apply to our gardens to really maximize their usefulness for bees. And then I'll just conclude with resources that we have available to us on our website of the Bee Garden at UC Davis. And although we are, of course, based in Northern California, we try to make these resources as comprehensive as we can, so that anyone in the state will find some value in them. So that includes the blog, our social media, and also our YouTube channel, where we have a number of videos about things like identifying common bees, plants to use at certain times of the year, etc. So that concludes my presentation. I thank you so much for your attention, and it looks like we've got a lot of questions in the chat. I'm going to go ahead and stop the screen sharing if that's okay with the hosts.
Yeah, that is fine. Thank you.
Okay.
There we are.
And so you want me to jump right into the chat?
Yeah, so
or do you want to leave that
down here to where the questions actually start?
Okay.
Hold on here. So the first question is, how large were the holes the native bees made along your garden paths?
So I didn't measure them exactly. The ones that the Longhorn bee makes, they're roughly the diameter of a pencil. And the sweat bees are proportionately smaller because they are a smaller bee.
Okay. Another person had a question about bee blocks. Is there a preferred or discouraged type of wood to use?
Not necessarily. I mean, I think redwood would be great, because that's something that is going to be native to our state, and is something that our native bees are probably used to using. Obviously, nothing that's been treated. So, don't buy, for those of you who don't know, if you buy lumber, like a fence post at the garden center, and you see a series of little lines in it, that means it's been pressure treated, because those lines are where the wood preservative has been injected into it. So definitely don't use those. We sell them at the garden, and what I do is whenever somebody takes down an old garden fence that has redwood fence posts, that's what I use to make blocks out of. So that would be a good source to use.
Very good. Where should the bee blocks be located? On the ground, mounted on a post or tree, or facing any particular direction, or in the shade?
So we do have a fact sheet on our website that goes into all the details about where to put them and how to make them. In general, you want the opening to be facing away from the prevailing wind. So for us, that our winds come from the north, so we face them south to southeast. And you want them, certainly in our climate, it's so hot that we want them to have afternoon shade. That, depending on where you are in San Diego, the San Diego area, that may not be as much of a consideration. You do want them to not be in a place where they can move. So you can maybe bracket them to a fence. Sometimes if you've got a tree that has a crotch in it that's a V shape, you can shove them in there. And in terms of height, obviously the bees will use a variety of heights. So I just tell people to put them at your eye level, because if you want to watch them.
That makes sense. Perfect. Next question, is there a preferred type of soil or soil mixture that bees prefer for nesting?
Whatever is native to the area. People ask that a lot. They have the idea that this tiny little bee has to get through the soil and we must need to, amend it or fluff it up or make it nice and soft. But, when you think about our native soils in areas that don't get any moisture or any rainfall all summer, they're hard as a rock. And the bees have the ability to go through that. So basically, just native soil, just leave it.
That's amazing. Does having a honeybee colony in a garden discourage native bees? Competition for flowers.
Yeah, boy, that is the $64,000 question. And is something that in terms of bee research is a really important area that we're really starting to delve into more. So there's a couple of things to think about in terms of honeybees with native bees. Obviously, if there's competition for resources, then that can definitely be a concern. But that depends on the floral resources, not only in your garden, but in the broader area. Another concern, of course, is disease transmission, because honeybees get a whole host of diseases, and many of those can be transmitted to our native bees. And in that regard, it's up to the beekeeper to be a good steward of their honeybees and make sure that they're healthy and don't have those diseases. There have been some studies documenting impacts on native bees from honeybees, but at this point, the work is so early that it would be hard to make a blanket statement about you should or shouldn't do this or that. I think the bottom line for me is to just make sure that there's lots of flowers and the right kind of flowers, and that you're not using pesticides on them.
Okay. We have one person that was with us on World Bee Day at the Japanese Friendship Garden. Her name is Patricia Simpson, and she works at the Cabrillo National Monument and a bee expert. And she was talking about to the honeybee keepers that they should be very careful not to let the hive split, and that a queen would fly off into the wild, because then what happens is when they create a new hive, they overcompete for the pollen that honeybees normally rely on, and that they literally wipe out a field of pollinating flowers and leave very little left for the native bees, is what she observed.
Yeah, and again, that there have been studies documenting similar effects, but we just haven't done enough of this work to make broader recommendations. But I definitely agree with her. The idea of those, especially in your area where the feral bees may very well be Africanized. I've been in natural areas and I've seen honeybees, and it just really, I have nothing against honeybees, but it just really bothers me in a natural area to not see native bees and to see honeybees instead. So I think that the bottom line is, as she said, it's really up to the honeybee keepers to be good stewards of their hives and to keep them healthy, to manage them appropriately so that you don't get those swarms.
Absolutely. Okay, next question from Greg Rubin. How does ceanothus rank in bee attractiveness?
Ceanothus should absolutely, positively, without a doubt, be in any bee garden. It's a wonderful, wonderful plant for bees. And what I really like about ceanothus, of course, depending on the variety, for us, the Valley Violet that does really well up here, it can start blooming actually as early as November, but more typically in January. And it's a great early season pollen source that our bumblebee queens need as they develop their eggs. So absolutely. And we try, in fact, on our YouTube channel, I have a video just about ceanothus and all the ones that do well for us in Northern California. The idea being that you can, start with the Valley Violet, and for us, Skylark would be the latest blooming, so that you can have something basically from January to June, have a ceanothus going in your garden.
Wonderful. What size drill bit is best for bee blocks?
So you want to have a diameter of the 3, 4, or 5/16 inch, but they do need to be at least 5.5 inches deep. So you need to, your average off the shelf drill bit probably isn't going to work. I know for the ones I made, I needed to buy special longer drill bits, but they were readily available on Amazon, basically just like everything is.
Everything is, yeah. What about cleaning the bee hotels?
Yeah, so once they get used, you can maybe let them be used for 2 years, and then you want to discard them because pathogens can build up in that wood, and the wood cannot be cleaned. You can't dump bleach in there. You can't drill it out. The only way to potentially keep it clean is there's paper straws that can be inserted into those that are used by the folks who raise mason bees. And if you then, once that gets used, you can pull the straw out, and then if there were any pathogens, they shouldn't have moved into the wood. But generally, you want to discard them after they've been used.
I've actually seen those at the Gottlieb Garden, which is a wonderful private garden in Los Angeles. That's occasionally on a tour.
Yeah, and those you can purchase if you've got a beekeeping supply house near you. You can purchase them there, or again, you can find them online. The only challenge is that they are designed just for mason bees, so they only come in one size.
Okay.
And I would also caution folks, don't think you can just buy any old paper straw, because a lot of the paper pulp comes from trees that has been treated with insect growth regulator pesticides. So you want to make sure you're buying one that is specifically designated for bees, to make sure that there's no pesticide residue in the paper.
Good point. Another question on charts, the higher the number, then the more important it is. I think they're referring to the ranking.
The ranking, basically the ranking meant that it was more attractive. The higher ranking was the higher number in terms of rank was actually the least preferred. So rank number 1 is the most preferred.
Okay, good to know.
So the low number is better.
Okay. Someone made a comment, great session. Can you go back and show the number of bees per genus in Southern California again?
You did you send these out to everybody, Christine?
I did.
Yeah, so they should have that on there, on the materials you sent out.
Okay, very good. So check your emails, everyone. The handouts were attached with your confirmation link.
And I'll add also that the group in Southern California has already written their study up, and it's being published in one of the scientific journals. And so that information will be available soon. And when that paper is published, Christine, we can certainly get you a copy of it.
Oh yeah, please send it, and I'll share it with the group. Thank you. Next question. The Xerces Society reps told me that it was a good idea to remove the honeybee hive, as they were actually livestock that compete with native bees for nectar and pollen. So I gave it to an orchard. I'm not sure. I think that's a statement rather than a question.
Yeah, but I guess it kind of gets at the question that we've been talking about. And again, there can be competition if there's not enough floral resources in an area. But of course, honeybees can fly for several miles. So just because you took it to an orchard doesn't necessarily mean that they're not going to come back to your garden, depending on how far away that orchard is. But, again, the bottom line is we just need more flowers in the environment.
Absolutely. We have bare soil areas, but don't water the area, and it is very dry. Do the native bees need soil with some moisture and to nest in?
No, they will just nest. Remember, they've been here for millions of years, long before we were here with our gardens. And they figured out how to use that soil just fine. So,
okay, let's see. Greg Rubin has another comment. I've seen Argentine ants robbing nectar from many plants, like flannel bush, and apparently driving off pollinators. Have you observed them driving off bees?
I've not seen that. We are very fortunate in the Haven to not have Argentine ants. We certainly, you'll get ants, you certainly will get ants going into honeybee hives. I can certainly believe that it happens, that you get ants going into plants and taking the nectar. And if there's enough of them, I can see that being disruptive to the bees. Other than putting tanglefoot or some kind of barrier on the plant stem that the ants can't go up, which of course could have impacts on the plant. That's a real challenging one.
While they're harvesting aphids for their nectar.
Yeah.
Does the presence of honeybee hives deter native bees from your garden?
Not really. In fact, there was an interesting study done. We're located here in Yolo County. There's a tremendous amount of sunflower production for seeds and oil, and those sunflower growers will all bring in honeybee hives for pollination. But there's also a group of native bees in that Longhorn bee group that, as I mentioned, have that preference for plants in the sunflower family. And honeybees tend to fly in straight lines, whereas those native bees tend to have more erratic back and forth flight patterns. And the way that the sunflowers are grown is you'll have about 10 rows of bearing plants to every 1 row of pollinizers. So when honeybees land on the pollinizer, they just tend to go down that row. They never go over to the bearing plants, and that can impact the yield. When you have both honeybees and those native bees present, the native bees try to annoy the honeybees. They don't like them there. They want them gone. So they actually will stimulate more honeybee movement, and you get a synergy where you get a greater yield by having both the native and the honeybees there together. But of course, that's a situation where you've got a field full of honeybees, a field full of sunflowers, where you've got tremendous resource availability. So resource limitation there is not a factor at all.
Mm-hmm. And also too, I think native bees, they vibrate, so they're able to get more pollen.
Yes, native bees, Carpenter bees, Bumble Bees, among others, can do a buzz pollination, which honeybees cannot do. It's a kind of a vibration pollination that shakes pollen out of otherwise inaccessible flowers. And we used to think that tomatoes were wind pollinated because honeybees cannot pollinate them, again, with that honeybee-centric view of everything. And that same group that did the study with the sunflowers found that when you surround tomato fields with floral borders, they're serving as attractants to those native bees, that you'll get greater tomato yield because you're increasing the pollination.
Right, and there's also native bees that are specific to squash, for instance.
Yes, the squash bee. Mm-hmm.
Sound very interesting. Okay, so someone had a question about dirty water and for bees and while not encouraging mosquitoes. Is there such a thing?
Yeah, so if you've got a dish of water for bees that's maybe 3/4 of an inch deep, certainly in our area that dries out every day. And depending where you are, it may dry out in a day or two. The mosquitoes, are even in the hottest weather, it's going to take mosquitoes 5 to 7 days to complete their life cycle. So that's not an issue. If you've got a pond or other more permanent water structure that you've got something on, like floating that bees can use, you can use the mosquito dunks, the Bacillus thuringiensis. It's a biological insecticide that is completely harmless to bees. It's very specific for dipterans.
Yeah, that's a great product to use.
Mm-hmm.
Is there competition between pollinators, bees versus monarchs versus hummingbirds?
Not really. Different flowers have evolved different shapes and structures to kind of naturally take care of that. And a great example is bees versus hummingbirds. So for one example, they see different colors preferentially. Hummingbirds have a strong preference for red. Bees have a preference for flowers that have landing pads. For example, think of the fused petals in a salvia. Those are a landing pad for bees. Bees need something to grasp onto with their legs while they insert their mouth parts into a flower. Hummingbirds don't need that. So different flowers have naturally evolved those different mechanisms so that competition doesn't happen.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Someone had a question about, they said, I get beehives on my house wall, even though I do not have any flowering plants. And my husband is allergic to bees. Any suggestions?
So they get bees on their flowers? Or
they get beehives on their house wall. So
I think they're talking about wasps.
Maybe.
Honeybees would not build, feral honeybees are going to build hives inside like hollow trees and things like that. Sometimes they will go into buildings if there's an opening, but I think they're thinking about wasps. Because paper wasps, for example, will build nests on the side of houses.
Okay. Well, do paper wasps sting?
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
But I'll just mention that since it came up, the UCIPM website has a great information about paper wasps and controlling them.
Okay, so, good. Okay.
If that's a problem.
Someone made a comment. There are also leafcutter bee tubes and blocks that can be removed to clean them.
Yeah, I think they're talking about those paper tubes.
Okay, got it.
That I mentioned.
Oh, someone said, well done. Thanks. Appreciate the resources too. So how specific are leafcutter bee species level, genus, family?
In terms of the plant material that they'll use for leaves?
It's not quite clear.
Yeah, so we certainly are in this area, we see a distinct preference for our native redbud. But I think even more than that, I mean, they'll use anything, depending on what's there. But redbuds as well as roses, both our native and non-native roses in this area seem to be well preferred. But I think the other consideration is how thick the leaf is, because of course, as leaves first emerge from bud, they don't have a complete cuticle on them yet. So they're a little bit easier for them to take that piece as opposed to when the leaf is fully mature and the cuticle has completely hardened. So leaf age plays a role as well.
Oh, right. Very good. Someone made a comment to get your native bee supplies from Crown Bees. I guess I don't know if that's local or online.
Yeah, any good beekeeping supply house will have those nesting materials.
Okay. And then the rest of the comments were so much good information. Thank you. Thank you. Great presentation. Wonderful presentation. Thank you. And love the presentation. Very informative. And thanks very much. Bye.
All right.
So that is the end of our questions, Christine. And we so appreciate you giving such a wonderful talk about native bees and how we can encourage more by planting.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And so this was such a timely talk, especially with Native Pollinator Week right around the corner from us.